in the 2024 elections, he blamed a number of immigration problems on Venezuelans that have fled Venezuela and the disaster that's been caused by Nicolas Maduro, claiming that a Venezuelan gang had taken over Aurora, Colorado. Not true. And also claiming that Nicolas Maduro had emptied his prisons and mental institutions and sent criminals into the United States to stir insecurity. Also not true.
President Trump's continued pressure on Venezuela and its authoritarian president, Nicolas Maduro, has been further ramped up this week with a blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving the country. Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, has now weighed in, calling Venezuela a country friendly to us, meaning Russia, and warning the United States not to make what he calls a fatal mistake as attacks on boats suspected of trafficking drugs continue. So, what is Mr. Trump's end game with the South American country? Let's talk to Dr. Christopher Sabatini, who is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. Good afternoon, Christopher.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Why is President Trump spending so much time on Venezuela?
There are a number of reasons. First of all, in 2019, he attempted to remove Maduro by working with the opposition to support the National Assembly president, Juan Guaido, who'd been elected as an interim president and created sort of a shadow government, as supposedly a democratic alternative to the Nicolas Maduro government. And Trump went all in, supporting, throwing his weight behind Juan Guaido as a legitimate president of Venezuela, even welcoming him to the State of the Union address. And saluting him as the legitimate president of Venezuela. But then 2 years later, the whole effort failed because he couldn't flip the military. Popular protests weren't enough. And so Trump failed, quite frankly. And so in the 2024 elections, he blamed a number of immigration problems on Venezuelans that have fled Venezuela and the disaster that's been caused by Nicolas Maduro, claiming that a Venezuelan gang had taken over Aurora, Colorado. Not true. And also claiming that Nicolas Maduro had emptied his prisons and mental institutions and sent criminals into the United States to stir insecurity. Also not true. And now he has a Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, for whom really Nicolas Maduro is enemy number one, a socialist government in the country that is supporting the Cuban government in Cuba. So this is really about regime change. It's also in part about revenge. And it's also in part trying to frame this time around the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again, and protecting the U.S.
So you're skeptical about that this is really about stopping the spread of drugs and oil and all that?
Let's start with the rhetoric. First of all, he's defined these people as narco-terrorists, these people in small speedboats that are representing a direct risk to American citizens. They're not combatants. It's quite a stretch of the rules of law, of war rather, to call them such. He's not giving them due process. He's simply blowing the boats out of the water. But also there's a mere fact is that Venezuela does not produce fentanyl, which is the major driver and source of American overdoses, but also only about 5 to 8% of the cocaine that reaches the U.S. comes from Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't produce it. It's a transshipment point. Most of the cocaine that passes through Venezuela is on its way to West Africa and Europe. So no, this was an entire ruse intended to frighten Nicolas Maduro and the inner circle around him into encouraging some form of a palace coup that could lead to a transition.
I should say, Christopher, the full disclosure here, my own family come to the country next door, Guyana, and Venezuela claims 2/3 of our territory, and frankly, more importantly, I think wants to commandeer the oil resources that have been discovered offshore in Guyana over the last 10 years, which amount to something, billions and billions of barrels of good oil. So there's something. So I'll be completely clear. I'm not neutral here. I was once on the verge of being conscripted to stop a Venezuelan invasion when I was at school, but. Can Maduro actually survive this? I mean, the Venezuelans seem to have been on this side of things and this way of doing things for many, many decades.
First of all, Trevor, appreciate your giving full disclosure. I completely understand. And not coincidentally, in the lead up to the elections last year, Nicolas Maduro, in 2023, held a referendum on whether the Essequibo region that you're talking about was Venezuela, and it won overwhelmingly. So, and it goes to your question.
As we say in Guyana, Essequibo are we own. it's ours. Carry on.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So in this case, and with legitimacy, let's be honest. But what he does, and he tried to do it then, is try to stoke nationalism in Venezuela for a rally around the flag effect. That didn't work so much there. And then subsequently in the elections in 2024, he flagrantly stole them against an opposition that had elected a primary candidate, Maria Corina Machado, who last week received the Nobel Peace Prize, but then was prohibited from running, but threw her weight behind a stand-in candidate. Will he survive? I mean, he's going to pull out all the stops he can to make this a nationalist issue, to try to rally those around him. And quite frankly, despite numerous attempts to unseat him, whether through the elections, through the creation of Juan Guaido, he has a very tight, very corrupt criminal organization around him that will protect him. And the hope, I quite frankly think that the hope that they would rally and remove him and stage some sort of democratic transition is naive at best, or even dangerously naive, because quite frankly, the Trump administration is correct in this. This is a government that uses illicit resources, whether it's through illicit sale of black market oil that is sanctioned, which we saw the seizure of the tanker last week, or it's through narcotics trafficking, not production, or it's through illegal gold mining and money laundering. They survive on criminal activities. So the thought that they could just basically remove the leader and there'd be some form of a transition that could lead to a more democratic, transparent, accountable, even an opposition-led government is quite folly. And I think the entire strategy is based on this idea, as I like to say, of regime change on the cheap. They're trying to scare the inner circle and Maduro into leaving, but without having to put boots on the ground. I'm not arguing for boots on the ground, by the way, but I do think this is why we see this escalation.
Well, finally, last question. Could there be a shooting war here?
This is what we don't know, quite frankly. I mean, he's clearly escalated. He's gone from about 5 to 10 boats, and now there are over 16 boats, 16,000 service people there off the coast, flights that are kind of skirting Venezuelan airspace. There could be, first of all, there could just be a mistake. A missile that shoots down a U.S. plane, amphibious landing that tries to send a message and which causes American deaths. He could try to launch a few missiles into Venezuela to, again, try to rattle the military. But the fact remains, this whole mission, the narrative has changed multiple times, and American citizens don't support it. More than 65% of Americans oppose an invasion in Venezuela. So there could be a slip up. This is still very open-ended, and Trump is at huge risk of embarrassing himself. But the truth is the American people are not behind it.
Christopher Sabatini, thank you so much. That was Dr. Christopher Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House.
Venezuela's been a very bad actor. They've been, as you know, they've been sending millions of people into our country, many of them Tren de Aragua, some of the worst gangs, some of the worst people anywhere in the world in terms of gangs. And we had some in Washington, D.C. We took care of them very quickly, but they're out of here. They've gone. But Venezuela's been very bad, both in terms of drugs and sending some of the worst criminals anywhere in the world into our country.
Would you like to see regime change in Venezuela?
Well, we're not talking about that, but we are talking about the fact that you had an election which was a very strange election. Now, what does that mean? That means there's no drugs coming by sea, but they do come by land. And you know what? We're telling the cartels right now, we're going to be stopping them too. When they come by land, we're going to be stopping them the same way we stop the boats.